The Christmas crowds at Northgate Mall had no idea that death was about to walk through their doors. They definitely had no idea that their salvation would come from a tired-looking woman in yoga pants and a messy ponytail, juggling two restless kids and a worn purse. A woman who, 15 minutes later, would take an impossible 300-yard shot through a crowded mall to drop a terrorist with a single bullet to the head. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria Thompson looked like any other suburban mom that Saturday morning in Tampa, Florida. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail that had seen better days, strands escaping around her face as she wrestled with her 7-year-old son, Jake's shoelaces in the front hallway. Her faded jeans bore the telltale signs of motherhood: a small stain from yesterday's spaghetti dinner, a streak of chalk dust from helping with homework, and the permanent crease marks that came from chasing children through playgrounds. "Mom, can we go to the toy store first?" Jake bounced on his toes, his energy barely contained despite having eaten 3 bowls of cereal that morning. His younger sister Lily, barely 5, clutched a small stuffed rabbit and nodded enthusiastically in agreement. "We'll see, buddy," Victoria replied, her voice carrying the patient tone of a woman who had learned to manage expectations. "We're going to get Grandma's present first. Then maybe we can look at toys." She grabbed her keys from the ceramic bowl by the door, the same bowl that held spare change, hair ties, and the accumulated debris of family life. The December air in Tampa was crisp but not cold, nothing like the brutal winters she'd endured during her deployment years. Victoria helped both children into the back seat of her Honda Pilot, a practical choice covered in soccer ball stickers and bearing a small dent on the rear bumper from last month's grocery store encounter. As she adjusted the rearview mirror, her eyes caught her own reflection for just a moment. At 34, she looked tired but content, her face showing the gentle lines that came from years of bedtime stories and school pickup lines. What no reflection could show, what no neighbor would ever suspect, was that those same gentle hands buckling car seats had once held a Barrett M82 sniper rifle steady at 1,200 yards. At the woman who now spent her mornings packing lunchboxes and signing permission slips had once been Staff Sergeant Victoria Thompson, 2nd Marine Scout Sniper Unit with 43 confirmed kills in Kandahar Province and a reputation that made hardened Marines speak in hush, respectful tones. The drive to Northgate Mall took 18 minutes, filled with Jake's running commentary on everything they passed and Lily's soft humming to her stuffed rabbit. Victoria navigated the holiday traffic with the same calm precision she'd once used to navigate mountain passes in Afghanistan, though now her biggest concern was finding a parking spot close enough to avoid a complete meltdown from tired children. Northgate Mall sprawled across 40 acres of Tampa's northeast side, a 3-story monument to American consumer culture, complete with department stores, specialty shops, a food court that could seat 800 people, and a central atrium that rose 3 stories high with glass elevators and a decorative fountain. On this particular Saturday, 2 weeks before Christmas, it was packed with families, teenagers, and last-minute shoppers creating a constant hum of conversation, laughter, and the ambient noise of cash registers and credit card machines. Victoria held each child's hand as they entered through the main entrance near Macy's, her eyes automatically scanning the crowd with an awareness she couldn't quite shake. It was habit now, this constant evaluation of exits, sightlines, and potential threats. Dr. Patricia Henley, the VA counselor she'd seen for 6 months after her discharge, had called it hypervigilance, a common response to combat trauma. Victoria just called it being careful. They made their way through the crowded corridor toward the center of the mall, passing storefront windows decorated with artificial snow and twinkling lights. Jake pressed his face against the window of GameStop, his breath fogging the glass as he pointed excitedly at the latest video game displays. Lily remained close to Victoria's side, overwhelmed by the noise and crowd, but trusting her mother completely. "Can we sit by the fountain for a minute?" Lily asked, tugging on Victoria's jacket. "Bunny wants to see the water." Victoria smiled and guided them toward the central atrium, where families clustered around the 3-tiered fountain with its gentle splash of water and scattered pennies representing dozens of Christmas wishes. She found a spot on one of the circular benches, grateful for a moment to rest and let the children decompress from the sensory overload of the busy mall. As she watched Jake and Lily point at the fountain and whisper to each other, Victoria felt the familiar mixture of contentment and restlessness that had become her normal state. This was her life now: soccer practices and parent-teacher conferences, grocery shopping and bedtime routines. It was a good life, a peaceful life, everything she'd fought for during those long months in the desert. So why did some part of her miss the clarity of purpose she had found in the scope of a rifle?
She shook her head, dismissing the thought. That woman was gone, buried under years of civilian life and maternal responsibility. Staff Sergeant Thompson was a ghost, and Victoria preferred it that way. Her children would never have to know about the medals in the shoebox at the top of her closet, or the nightmares that sometimes still woke her at 3 a.m., or the reason she could estimate wind speed and calculate bullet drop while standing in a shopping mall. The morning shoppers continued to flow around them, families and couples and groups of teenagers, all focused on their own concerns and completely unaware that they were sharing space with someone who had once been one of the military's most elite marksmen. Victoria looked like just another tired mom in a crowd of tired moms, and that anonymity felt like armor. She had no way of knowing that in exactly 12 minutes, a man with cold eyes and military-grade weapons would walk through those same entrance doors. She had no way of knowing that her carefully constructed civilian life was about to collide with her buried past in the most violent way possible. And she certainly had no way of knowing that before the morning was over, that tired-looking woman in yoga pants would remind everyone in Northgate Mall, and eventually the entire world, that some skills never fade and some warriors never truly retire. But for now, in the gentle chaos of a busy shopping mall on a Saturday morning, Victoria Thompson was just another mom watching her children make wishes at a fountain, perfectly ordinary and completely invisible.
Alexei Viper Kozlov entered Northgate Mall through the east entrance at exactly 10:47 a.m., his heavy boots echoing against the polished tile floor with the measured cadence of someone who had walked into battlefields before. To the casual observer, he looked like any other shopper: dark jeans, black leather jacket, a baseball cap pulled low over sharp Slavic features. But Victoria's trained eye caught the details that others missed: the slight bulge under his left armpit where a shoulder holster disrupted the line of his jacket, the way his eyes moved in systematic sweeps rather than the random wandering of a casual browser, and, most telling of all, the rigid posture of someone carrying significant weight distributed across their torso. The children were still enchanted by the fountain, Jake now trying to spot the oldest pennies at the bottom, while Lily held serious conversations with her stuffed rabbit about the wishes they should make. Victoria watched them with half her attention, while the other half tracked the man in the leather jacket as he moved through the crowd with predatory precision. Her pulse didn't quicken. That was the first thing they'd trained out of her in sniper school. Elevated heart rate meant unsteady hands, and unsteady hands meant missed shots. Instead, she felt the familiar descent into a state of heightened awareness that her old unit commander had called combat calm. Time seemed to slow slightly, sounds became more distinct, and her peripheral vision expanded as her nervous system shifted into a mode most civilians never experienced. The man stopped at the electronics store directly across from the fountain, but he wasn't looking at phones or tablets. His attention was fixed on the central atrium's layout, the angles, the sightlines, the flow of foot traffic. Victoria recognized the behavior because she'd done it herself countless times in Afghanistan, cataloging every detail of an environment before an operation. "Mommy, can we go to the toy store now?" Jake's voice seemed to come from very far away, though he was standing right beside her. "In just a minute, sweetheart," she replied, her voice steady while every instinct screamed that something was deeply wrong. She pulled out her phone, thumb hovering over 911. But what would she tell them? That a man in a leather jacket was walking through a public space? That her combat-trained intuition was sounding alarms? They'd think she was having a PTSD episode. The man moved again, this time toward the center of the atrium, where families clustered around the fountain and the entrance to the food court. As he walked, Victoria caught the unmistakable metallic click of something being armed,
a sound so subtle that it would be lost in the ambient mall noise to anyone who hadn't spent years training to identify weapons by sound alone. That was when she saw the vest. It was just a glimpse as his jacket fell open for half a second, but Victoria's trained eye caught the distinctive pattern of cylindrical objects arranged in rows across his chest. Military-grade explosive vest, probably C4 based on the color and configuration, with enough firepower to bring down half the mall's central structure. Her mouth dried, but her hands remained steady as she casually shifted position on the bench, placing herself between the threat and her children while simultaneously scanning for exit routes. The nearest emergency exit was blocked by a crowd of teenagers. The main entrance they had used was 60 yards away through dense foot traffic. The service corridor she had noticed earlier would require getting past the threat to reach. "Ladies and gentlemen of Northgate Mall," the man's voice suddenly boomed across the atrium, electronically amplified by a small device he'd pulled from his pocket. The normal chatter of shoppers died instantly, replaced by confused murmurs and the sharp intake of breath from people who sensed that something was very wrong. "My name is Alexei Kozlov, and I am here to deliver a message to your government and your people." His accent was thick, Eastern European, with the flat delivery of someone reading from a prepared script. "You will remain calm, you will not attempt to leave, and you will listen." The transformation in the crowd was instantaneous. Confused murmurs became frightened whispers, then escalated to scattered screams as people spotted the weapons he was now displaying openly, an AK-47 variant slung across his chest, and what looked like a military-issue sidearm in his right hand. Victoria's mind automatically began calculating angles and distances. Kozlov had positioned himself well, central location with clear sight lines in all directions, his back to the fountain so no one could approach from behind, elevated slightly on the decorative stone rim so he could see over the crowd. It was tactically sound, the kind of positioning she'd use herself if she were trying to control a large space with minimal personnel. "Everyone move to the food court," Kozlov commanded, gesturing with his weapon toward the wide entrance 20 yards away. "Now. No running, no phones, no talking." The crowd began to move like frightened cattle, parents grabbing children, elderly shoppers struggling to keep up, teenagers helping younger kids who'd been separated from their families in the initial panic. Victoria stood slowly, keeping her movements calm and non-threatening while her mind raced through tactical assessments.
Single operator, which meant either this was a lone wolf attack or others were positioned where she couldn't see them. Explosive vest suggested this was intended as a suicide mission, which made negotiation unlikely. His weapons discipline was good, finger off the trigger until ready to fire, muzzle awareness, proper stance. Former military, almost certainly, which meant he'd be harder to surprise and more dangerous in a prolonged engagement. "Mommy, I'm scared," Lily whispered, pressing against Victoria's leg with her rabbit clutched tight against her chest. "I know, baby. Just stay close to me and do exactly what I tell you, okay?" Victoria's voice was calm and reassuring, the same tone she'd used to guide lost patrol members through firefights in the mountains of Afghanistan. As they were herded toward the food court with the rest of the crowd, Victoria caught sight of mall security. 2 guards in their 50s, both looking overwhelmed and uncertain, neither appearing to have any tactical training or appropriate weapons to deal with this situation. One was speaking urgently into his radio, probably calling for police backup, but response time to the mall would be at least 8 minutes, even under optimal conditions. 8 minutes was an eternity in a hostage situation. A lot of people could die in 8 minutes. Victoria kept her children close as they entered the food court, her eyes automatically cataloging every detail of their new environment. The space was large and open, with seating for several hundred people arranged around a central cluster of fast food vendors. High ceilings, multiple levels connected by escalators, and, most importantly, a second-floor balcony that ran along the entire perimeter of the space. She filed that information away as Kozlov took position near the main entrance, his weapon now trained on the crowd of terrified shoppers who sat huddled at tables or crouched behind the minimal cover of trash cans and decorative planters. His eyes were cold and focused, scanning the crowd with the mechanical precision of someone who viewed them not as people, but as tactical problems to be managed. Your police will arrive soon. When they do, they will learn that America's foreign policy has consequences, that the children you have killed in Syria and Yemen and Somalia are not forgotten. Today, your children will understand what it feels like to live in fear. Victoria's blood turned to ice. This wasn't just a hostage situation, it was a planned massacre, with her children sitting directly in the kill zone.
The first police units arrived exactly 7 minutes and 32 seconds after Kozlov's initial announcement. Victoria had been counting automatically, a habit from her military days, when timing could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She heard the sirens wailing in the distance, then the screech of tires on asphalt as patrol cars surrounded the mall's perimeter. From her position crouched behind an overturned table with Jake and Lily pressed against her sides, Victoria watched Kozlov's reaction to the approaching law enforcement. His posture remained calm, almost pleased, as he adjusted his position to maintain visual contact with both the hostages and the food court's main entrance. This was exactly what he'd wanted: maximum attention, maximum pressure, maximum opportunity for his message to be broadcast to the world. The first officers to breach the food court were Tampa PD patrol units, brave but clearly out of their depth. Victoria recognized the signs immediately, the way they moved too quickly through the entrance, their weapons drawn but held at improper angles for a crowded hostage scenario, their eyes wide with adrenaline rather than narrowed with tactical focus. Good cops, probably, but not prepared for military-trained terrorists with suicide vests. "Stay back," Kozlov shouted, raising his AK-47 toward the ceiling and firing 3 rounds in rapid succession. The gunshots echoed through the food court like thunder, sending screams through the crowd and causing several children to burst into hysterical tears. Plaster rained down from the bullet holes in the ceiling. "Anyone who enters this space dies, along with everyone in here." The first officers to breach the food court were Tampa PD patrol units, brave but clearly out of their depth. Victoria recognized the signs immediately, the way they moved too quickly through the entrance, their weapons drawn but held at improper angles for a crowded hostage scenario, their eyes wide with adrenaline rather than narrowed with tactical focus. Good cops, probably, but not prepared for military-trained terrorists with suicide vests. "Stay back," Kozlov shouted, raising his AK-47 toward the ceiling and firing 3 rounds in rapid succession. The gunshots echoed through the food court like thunder, sending screams through the crowd and causing several children to burst into hysterical tears. Plaster rained down from the bullet holes in the ceiling. "Anyone who enters this space dies, along with everyone in here." The patrol officers immediately retreated behind the concrete pillars at the food court entrance, their radios crackling with urgent requests for SWAT backup and crisis negotiators. I could hear fragments of their communications: confirmed explosive device, multiple hostages, request immediate tactical response. That was when she made her first mistake. She tried to help. Victoria carefully lifted her head above the overturned table, making eye contact with the nearest police officer, a young man with sergeant stripes whose nameplate read Martinez. She gestured subtly toward Kozlov's position, then held up her fingers to indicate what she'd observed. 1 shooter, explosive vest, professional positioning, likely military background. Sergeant Martinez stared at her blankly, then made a sharp gesture for her to get down and stay hidden. She tried again, this time mouthing words while pointing toward the second-floor balcony. High ground, clear shot, flanking position. These were concepts any tactical officer should understand, basic elements of hostage rescue that could save lives if implemented correctly. Martinez's response was to key his radio and speak in a voice just loud enough for Victoria to hear. "We've got a civilian trying to interfere with operations. Middle-aged female, appears to be in shock, giving hand signals, might need medical attention for psychological trauma." Victoria felt a familiar frustration rise in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times in Afghanistan, when intelligence was ignored, when local knowledge was dismissed, when politics trumped tactics. But this was different. These weren't bureaucrats in air-conditioned offices making decisions about distant battlefields. These were good people trying to save lives, and they had no way of knowing that the panicked civilian crouched behind the subway counter had more combat experience than their entire SWAT team combined. The situation deteriorated rapidly over the next 20 minutes. SWAT units arrived with impressive speed and professional equipment, but their tactical approach was textbook domestic law enforcement, designed for drug raids and barricaded suspects, not military-trained terrorists with suicide vests. Commander Patricia Hayes was the SWAT team leader, a competent professional with 15 years of experience in tactical operations. Victoria could see that immediately from her calm demeanor and efficient deployment of personnel. But Hayes was thinking like a cop, not like a soldier, and that fundamental difference in approach was going to get people killed. "This is Commander Hayes, Tampa Police Department." The negotiator's voice echoed through a bullhorn from the main entrance. "Alexei, I'd like to talk with you about resolving this situation peacefully." Kozlov's response was swift and brutal. He grabbed a teenage girl who had been hiding behind a potted plant, dragged her to the center of the food court where everyone could see her, and pressed his sidearm against her temple. "My name is not Alexei to you. I am the voice of the dead children your country has murdered, and your resolution will be written in blood unless your government broadcasts my message to the world within 1 hour." The girl, probably no more than 16, was crying so hard her entire body shook. I recognized the signs of shock setting in: pale complexion, rapid breathing, the glassy look in her eyes that meant she was beginning to disassociate from the trauma.
Victoria couldn't stand it anymore. She carefully made her way toward the SWAT position, moving low and slow to avoid drawing Kozlov's attention, until she was close enough to speak directly to Commander Hayes. "Commander," she whispered urgently, "I need to tell you something important about the tactical situation." Hayes barely glanced at her, focused on the standoff playing out in the food court. "Ma'am, I need you to return to the safe area with the other civilians. We have trained negotiators handling this." "I am trained," Victoria insisted, keeping her voice low but urgent. "Military background. I can see things from this angle that your people can't. He's got blind spots on his left flank, and there's a maintenance access on the second level that—" "Ma'am." Hayes's tone became firmer, though still professional. "I understand you're trying to help, but civilian interference in tactical operations puts everyone at greater risk. Officer Chen will escort you back to the safe zone." Officer Lisa Chen appeared beside Victoria with a gentle but firm grip on her elbow. "Come on, honey. Let's get you back with your kids where it's safe. The professionals have this under control." Victoria wanted to scream. She wanted to grab Hayes by the shoulders and explain that she'd run operations in Kandahar that made this look like a training exercise, that she'd studied terrorist tactics and hostage scenarios for years, that she could see exactly how this was going to end if they didn't adapt their approach. But she also knew that any aggressive behavior would immediately brand her as unstable, potentially dangerous, certainly not credible. So she allowed Officer Chen to guide her back to where Jape and Lily waited, their small faces etched with confusion and fear. She crouched down beside them again, pulling them close, while her tactical mind continued analyzing the situation with growing dread. The SWAT team was good, but they were preparing for the wrong kind of fight. They were thinking about minimal casualties and de-escalation, while Kozlov was planning maximum carnage and martyrdom. They were following protocols designed for criminals who wanted to escape, not terrorists who wanted to die. And in about 45 minutes, when their negotiation attempts failed and Kozlov decided to make good on his threats, a lot of innocent people were going to pay the price for that fundamental misunderstanding. Victoria closed her eyes and tried to calculate angles from memory, mapping the food court's architecture against her knowledge of long-range shooting positions. Somewhere in this mall was a sight line that could end this situation with a single shot. The question was whether she could find it and whether she could bring herself to become Staff Sergeant Thompson again before it was too late.
The weight of a Barrett M82 sniper rifle was 57 pounds when fully loaded with a 10-round magazine of .5 caliber BMG ammunition. Victoria could still feel that weight in her arms, even now, 8 years after she'd last held one. The muscle memory was as permanent as scar tissue, the way the bipod legs needed to be adjusted for uneven terrain, the subtle vibration through the stock when the rifle was properly zeroed, the particular rhythm of breathing required to make impossible shots at distances that reduced human beings to barely visible dots. Staff Sergeant Victoria Thompson had been the youngest female Marine ever accepted into the Scout Sniper program, and one of only 12 women to complete the grueling 13-week course at Quantico. Out of the 43 Marines who started her class, only 18 graduated. Of those 18, Victoria ranked third in marksmanship scores and first in fieldcraft, the art of moving unseen through hostile territory, of becoming invisible in plain sight. Her first deployment to Kandahar province came in 2016 when she was 26 years old and convinced she could save the world one perfect shot at a time. The reality of war had been both brutal and more boring than she'd expected. Weeks of lying motionless in carefully constructed hides, watching through high-powered scopes as Taliban fighters moved through distant valleys, waiting for the moment when rules of engagement aligned with opportunity. Her longest confirmed kill had been at 1,847 yards, nearly two-thirds of a mile, on a windless morning when she'd spotted a Taliban sniper setting up to target a Marine patrol. Through her scope, she'd watched him arrange his equipment with the same methodical precision she used herself, and she'd felt a strange kinship with the man she was about to kill. They were practitioners of the same deadly art, separated by politics and geography, but united by an understanding of patience, mathematics, and the physics of death. The shot had taken her 47 minutes to set up, calculating wind drift across that distance, accounting for the Coriolis effect of the Earth's rotation, adjusting for temperature and humidity, and the subtle variations in ammunition that could mean the difference between a clean kill and a wounded enemy who would escape to fight another day. When she finally squeezed the trigger, the bullet had taken nearly 3 seconds to reach its target, long enough for her to wonder if she'd miscalculated, long enough to see the Taliban fighter begin to turn toward her position as if sensing danger. The .5 caliber round had struck him center mass, and he'd simply disappeared from her scope. At that distance, through the heat shimmer rising from the Afghan desert, death looked like a magic trick. One moment a person existed, the next moment they didn't. 43 confirmed kills over 2 deployments. 43 human beings who had stopped breathing because Victoria Thompson possessed an unusual combination of steady hands, mathematical precision, and the psychological ability to remain calm while taking human life at impossible distances. The military had decorated her extensively, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart from the IED incident that had nearly ended her career, Presidential Unit Citation for her role in Operation Mountain Viper. But the medal that meant the most to her was the one they didn't give out officially, the unspoken respect of her fellow Marines. In a culture that worshipped marksmanship above almost every other skill, Victoria had achieved something approaching legendary status. Marines who had never met her knew her call sign, Ghost 6, and the stories of shots that defied belief and probability. The nightmares had started during her second deployment. Not dreams of the people she'd killed. Victoria had made peace with that necessity years ago, but dreams of the shots she'd missed. The Taliban commander who had escaped because of a sudden gust of wind. The suicide bomber she had in her sights for 8 seconds but couldn't engage because of civilian foot traffic. The IED emplacer who had spotted her position and disappeared into a crowd of children before she could take the shot. Each missed opportunity haunted her more than 43 confirmed kills because Victoria understood that in war, the shots you don't take matter as much as the ones you do. Every enemy who escaped could kill more Marines tomorrow. Every hesitation in the face of difficult circumstances could result in American casualties that might have been prevented. The injury that ended her military career came not from enemy fire, but from the concussive blast of a roadside bomb that had detonated 30 yards from her observation position. The explosion had thrown her against a concrete wall hard enough to fracture 3 ribs and give her a traumatic brain injury that left her with persistent headaches and occasional double vision. More importantly for her career, it had damaged the fine motor control in her right hand. Not enough to affect normal activities, but enough to introduce a barely perceptible tremor that made precision shooting unreliable. The Marine Corps had offered her a medical retirement with full benefits and a disability rating that would ensure financial security for the rest of her life. Instead, Victoria had requested an honorable discharge and walked away from the only identity she'd ever known. She'd wanted to prove to herself that she could exist as something other than a weapon, that she could build a life based on creation rather than destruction.
Meeting David Thompson had been the final piece of her transformation. He was a high school history teacher, gentle and patient, and completely civilian in a way that both comforted and occasionally frustrated her. He'd known about her military service from the beginning. It was impossible to hide completely. But he'd never pressed for details about what she'd actually done in Afghanistan. When she'd finally told him, one night after too much wine and too many memories, his response had been simple. That was then, this is now. They'd married 18 months later, and Victoria had thrown herself into domestic life with the same intensity she'd once brought to warfare. Learning to cook elaborate meals, decorating their first apartment, planning a future that included children and school plays and soccer practices, all the normal experiences she'd never thought she'd want. Jake had been born 3 years after her discharge, and Lily 2 years after that. Victoria had discovered that the same patience and precision that made her an exceptional sniper also made her a natural mother. The ability to remain calm under pressure, to think tactically about problems, to maintain situational awareness while juggling multiple priorities, these skills translated surprisingly well to raising children. But she'd never entirely escaped the warrior she'd been. Late at night, when the house was quiet and her family slept safely in their beds, Victoria would sometimes find herself standing at the bedroom window, unconsciously scanning roof lines and calculating fields of fire. The instincts never fully disappeared. They just went dormant, waiting for the moment when they might be needed again. Now, crouched behind an overturned table in a mall food court, with her children pressed against her sides and a terrorist holding innocent people at gunpoint, Victoria felt those dormant instincts awakening like muscle memory. Staff Sergeant Thompson was stirring inside the soccer mom, and she realized with crystal clarity that some transformations were never as complete as you believed them to be.
15 more minutes have passed. Kozlov's voice cut through the food court like a blade, his accent thick with controlled fury. Your government shows no respect for the lives of these innocent people. Perhaps they need a demonstration of my commitment to this cause. The teenage girl he'd been holding at gunpoint for the past 20 minutes had stopped crying, which Victoria knew from experience was a bad sign. Psychological shock was setting in, the girl's mind beginning to protect itself by shutting down emotional responses. In a few more minutes, she might stop responding to commands entirely, which could trigger Kozlov into more violent action. Victoria had been studying the terrorists' behavior patterns since the standoff began, cataloging every detail with the methodical precision her old sniper instructors had drilled into her. Kozlov moved with military discipline, never presenting the same angle to potential shooters for more than a few seconds, constantly scanning for threats, maintaining tactical awareness even while delivering his political speeches. But he also showed signs of increasing agitation, more frequent position changes, tighter grip on his weapons, the slight tremor in his non-firing hand that suggested adrenaline was beginning to override training. He was approaching the psychological breaking point where ideology would trump tactical thinking. She'd seen it before in Afghanistan, the moment when a cornered enemy decided that dying for the cause was preferable to prolonging the engagement. From her position behind the overturned table, she could see Commander Hayes coordinating with her tactical team through hand signals. Good operational security, but their approach was still fundamentally flawed. They were treating this like a domestic hostage situation that could be resolved through negotiation and patience, not recognizing that Kozlov had never intended to leave this mall alive.
"Commander," she whispered urgently during a brief lull in the terrorists' demands. She had managed to position herself close enough to the SWAT team's forward position to be heard without exposing herself to Kozlov's line of sight. "He's escalating toward violence. Military behavioral patterns indicate he's past the negotiation threshold." Hayes glanced at her with barely concealed irritation. "Ma'am, I've asked you repeatedly to maintain distance from operational personnel. You're compromising our tactical coordination." "I'm trying to help you understand what you're dealing with," Victoria pressed, keeping her voice low but urgent. "This isn't a criminal who wants to escape. He's exhibiting textbook pre-martyrdom indicators. The psychological profile suggests you're experiencing acute stress reaction," interrupted Dr. Angela Foster, the crisis negotiator who had arrived with the second wave of tactical units. Foster was a competent professional with extensive training in hostage psychology, but her expertise was in dealing with domestic perpetrators, not military-trained terrorists. Victoria felt the familiar frustration of being dismissed by people who didn't know what they didn't know. In Afghanistan, lives had been lost because intelligence officers ignored input from experienced warfighters, because bureaucratic protocols overrode tactical reality. She was watching the same dangerous dynamic play out in real time. "Listen to me," she said, allowing some of her old command authority to creep into her voice. "I have direct experience with—" "Ma'am?" Commander Hayes' tone became sharp enough to cut through Victoria's words. "If you continue to interfere with tactical operations, I will have you detained as a potential accomplice or security threat. Your behavior is erratic, you're showing unusual knowledge of terrorist tactics, and you're disrupting trained professionals who are trying to save lives." The accusation hit Victoria like a physical blow. In her desperation to prevent a massacre, she had revealed too much tactical awareness, raised suspicions about how a suburban mom could possess such specific knowledge of military operations. Now the very expertise that could save lives was being interpreted as evidence of complicity. She forced herself to back away from the SWAT position, hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "I understand. I'll maintain distance." But even as she retreated, Victoria continued her tactical assessment of the situation. The SWAT snipers had established positions at 3 locations around the food court perimeter, but none of them had clear shots due to the civilian hostages clustered around Kozlov's position. Their equipment was excellent. I recognized the distinctive profiles of Remington 700 rifles with advanced optics, but their positioning showed a fundamental misunderstanding of the target's behavior patterns. Kozlov was too experienced to present a static target for conventional police snipers. He moved constantly, used hostages as human shields, and positioned himself with his back to solid cover. Any attempt to take him down from the current SWAT positions would require shots through or around innocent civilians, tactically impossible without accepting massive collateral casualties.
What they needed was an elevated position with clear line of sight to the food court floor, somewhere Kozlov couldn't monitor while maintaining visual control over his hostages. Victoria's eyes traced the mall's architecture, calculating angles and distances with automatic precision. The second-floor balcony that ran around the food court's perimeter would provide multiple shooting positions, but accessing it would require moving through areas that Kozlov could observe. However, there was another option that the SWAT team had missed entirely. Directly above the food court was a third-floor maintenance level, accessible through service corridors that connected to the mall's upper-level retail spaces. From that height, a skilled marksman could achieve a downward angle shot that bypassed the human shields and provided a clear target zone. The challenge would be range and angle. Victoria estimated the distance at approximately 300 yards through the mall's complex interior architecture, with a steep downward trajectory that would require significant adjustments to normal ballistics calculations. It was a difficult shot under ideal conditions, nearly impossible without proper equipment and preparation time, but it was doable. She'd made harder shots in Afghanistan under worse conditions. The realization crystallized with terrifying clarity. She was the only person in this mall who possessed both the tactical knowledge to identify the optimal shooting position and the marksmanship skills to make the shot. The SWAT snipers were competent professionals, but they were trained for urban law enforcement scenarios, not military-style precision shooting at extended range with complex ballistics. "Mommy," Why are you shaking? Lily's small voice broke through Victoria's tactical calculations. Victoria looked down to find her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline surge that came with recognizing the approach of combat. Her body was preparing itself for action as her mind wrestled with the implications. To save these people, she would have to become Staff Sergeant Thompson again. She would have to access skills she'd spent 8 years trying to forget, embrace an identity she'd worked so hard to transform, and she would have to do it all while her own children watched, potentially destroying forever their image of their mother as a safe, peaceful presence in their lives. The terrorist's voice rose again, more agitated than before. Your silence tells me everything I need to know about American values. In 5 minutes, I will begin executing hostages, starting with the children. Let your government explain that to the world. Victoria closed her eyes and felt the last vestiges of her civilian identity begin to crack. Some choices, once made, could never be unmade.
The 5 minutes Kozlov had promised stretched like hours in Victoria's mind, each second marked by the steady rhythm of her heartbeat and the mathematical precision of her tactical calculations. She had identified the shot, mapped the route to the third-floor maintenance level, and calculated the ballistics for a 300-yard downward angle engagement. What she didn't have was a weapon, access to the shooting position, or any way to execute the plan without abandoning her children in the middle of a terrorist attack. "Jake, Lily," she whispered, pulling both children close enough to feel their rapid breathing against her chest. "I need you to listen very carefully to Mommy, okay? Can you be very brave for me?" Both children nodded, their eyes wide with fear but still trusting her completely. That trust cut through Victoria's heart like a knife. They had no idea their mother was about to ask them to do something that could get them all killed. "I need you to crawl very quietly to where Officer Martinez is standing." She pointed toward the young police sergeant who had dismissed her warnings earlier. "Stay low, stay quiet, and tell him exactly these words. My mommy says the ghost needs to fly. Can you remember that?" "Ghost needs to fly," Jake repeated solemnly. "Why can't you come with us?" Lily asked, her small hand clutching Victoria's jacket. "I need you to go very quietly to where Officer Martinez is standing. Stay low, stay quiet, and tell him exactly these words. My mommy says the ghost needs to fly. Can you remember that?" "Ghost needs to fly," Jake repeated solemnly. "Why can't you come with us?" Lily asked, her small hand clutching Victoria's jacket. "Because Mommy has to do something very important to keep everyone safe. But I promise you, I will come back to you. No matter what happens, I will come back." The words felt like a vow carved in stone. Victoria kissed both children on the forehead, tasting salt from tears she didn't remember shedding, then watched as they began their careful crawl toward the police position. Every instinct screamed at her to follow, to keep them close, to prioritize their immediate safety over the larger tactical picture. But she'd learned long ago in Afghanistan that sometimes protecting the people you love most meant accepting terrible risks. As soon as Jake and Lily reached Officer Martinez, Victoria began moving in the opposite direction, using the overturned tables and scattered debris as cover while she worked her way toward the service corridor she'd identified earlier. Her movements were smooth and silent, drawing on years of training in battlefield movement techniques that most people never learned. The maintenance access was exactly where the mall's architectural logic suggested it should be, an unmarked door behind the Chinese food vendor, designed to be invisible to shoppers but accessible to cleaning crews and repair technicians. Victoria had noticed it during their earlier walk through the mall, the way she'd trained herself to notice all the exits, service areas, and alternate routes in any building she entered. The door was locked, but the lock was a standard commercial-grade mechanism that yielded to techniques she'd learned in military breach training. 30 seconds with a hairpin and the steady pressure of someone who understood how tumblers worked, and she was through. The maintenance corridor was exactly what she'd expected. Narrow, poorly lit, with concrete walls and the distinctive smell of industrial cleaning supplies. But more importantly, it led upward through a series of service stairs that connected to the mall's upper levels. Victoria moved through the space with practiced silence, her civilian shoes making barely a whisper against the concrete floor. The third-floor maintenance area opened into a space that looked like the skeleton of the mall. Exposed beams, HVAC equipment, and a maze of walkways that maintenance crews used to access the building's infrastructure without disrupting retail operations.
Through steel grating in the floor, Victoria could see down into the food court where Kozlov continued to hold his hostages. The angle was perfect. From this position, she had clear line of sight to the target's location, an unobstructed shooting lane that bypassed all the civilian hostages, and a downward trajectory that would drive any bullets safely into the floor, rather than risking overpenetration into crowd areas. What she didn't have was a rifle. Victoria's tactical assessment had been based on the assumption that she could somehow acquire one of the SWAT sniper weapons, but now, standing in the perfect shooting position without any way to take the shot, she felt the crushing weight of tactical impossibility. She had the skills, the position, and the opportunity, but not the tools. That's when she heard footsteps on the maintenance stairs behind her. "Ma'am, you need to come with me immediately." The voice was calm but authoritative, and Victoria recognized it as belonging to Detective Frank Sullivan, the mall security supervisor who had been coordinating with police units since the crisis began. Victoria turned slowly, hands visible and non-threatening. "Detective, I know it looks like you've identified the optimal shooting position for engaging the target. Barrett 82, right? Or did you prefer the M24 system in theater?" The question hit Victoria like an electric shock. This wasn't the voice of a civilian security guard. This was someone speaking her language, using terminology that only military snipers would know. Sullivan stepped into the maintenance area, and Victoria could see his eyes for the first time. They were the eyes of someone who had seen combat, who understood the weight of life-and-death decisions, who recognized the look of a warrior forced back into service.
Staff Sergeant Frank Sullivan, 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, he said formally. 2 tours in Fallujah, 1 in Helmand Province. And unless I'm very much mistaken, you're the Marine they used to call Ghost 6. Victoria felt her carefully constructed civilian identity crumble completely. "How did you—" "The way you moved, the tactical assessment, the fact that you identified this position while trained SWAT snipers missed it completely." Sullivan reached into his jacket and pulled out a service pistol, not the standard security guard sidearm Victoria had expected, but a military-issue Sig Sauer P226. More importantly, your kids delivered a message that only someone with high-level sniper training would know to send. "Ghost needs to fly," Victoria said quietly. "Radio brevity code for a sniper requesting immediate fire support," Sullivan nodded. "I haven't heard that phrase in 6 years, not since my last deployment ended." The implications crashed over Victoria like a wave. Another veteran, someone who understood the stakes, someone who might actually listen to tactical advice instead of dismissing her as a panicked civilian. "The shot is makeable from this position. 300 yards, steep downward angle, minimal wind factors in an enclosed space. But I need a rifle," Sullivan finished. "I know where the SWAT snipers have positioned their backup weapons. The question is whether you're ready to be Staff Sergeant Thompson again." Through the steel grating, Victoria could see Kozlov grabbing another hostage, a young boy about Jake's age, terror written across his small face. The terrorist's voice echoed up from below. 2 minutes remain. Your government silence will cost this child his life." Victoria looked into Sullivan's eyes and saw her own determination reflected back. Some fights chose you, whether you were ready or not. "Get me the rifle," she said. Detective Sullivan moved through the maintenance corridors with the fluid efficiency of someone who had navigated far more dangerous spaces under much worse conditions. Victoria followed, her mind automatically cataloging every sound, every shadow, every detail that might affect the shot she was about to attempt. Below them, through the steel grating and concrete infrastructure, Kozlov's voice continued its countdown with the mechanical precision of someone for whom killing had become routine. 90 seconds, the terrorist announced to his captive audience. "Your government has shown its true priorities. This child will die for American foreign policy." The SWAT sniper's backup position was exactly where Sullivan had indicated, a secondary weapons cache positioned behind concrete pillars on the mall's second level, close enough to the primary engagement zone to be tactically relevant, but far enough away to avoid immediate detection. The rifle case was military grade, locked, but not beyond Sullivan's apparent expertise with security systems. Inside, Victoria found something that made her breath catch. A Remington 700 Police LR, .308 Winchester caliber, with a Leupold Mark IV scope and a bipod system she recognized from her own service years. Not the Barrett M82 she'd trained on, but close enough to feel familiar in her hands. The weapon was clean, properly maintained, and zeroed for standard police sniper engagement ranges. 100 yard zero, Sullivan said quietly, reading the notation tape on the stock. You'll need to adjust for the 300-yard engagement and the downward angle. Victoria's hands moved across the rifle with muscle memory that transcended conscious thought. Chamber check, magazine seated, safety engaged, scope mount secure, the pre-firing inspection routine that had been drilled into her until it became as automatic as breathing. The weapon felt alien and familiar simultaneously, like putting on clothes from a life she'd tried to forget. 60 seconds, Kozlov's voice echoed from below. Victoria settled into shooting position behind the steel grating, extending the bipod legs and adjusting them for the uneven maintenance floor. The scope came up to her eye naturally, and suddenly, the food court snapped into crystal clarity 300 yards away and 30 feet below. Through the crosshairs, she could see everything with startling detail. The terrified face of the young boy Kozlov held at gunpoint, the scattered hostages cowering behind overturned tables, the SWAT snipers in their inadequate positions around the perimeter, and dominating the center of the scope picture, Alexei Kozlov himself, alert, dangerous, and completely unaware that death was calculating his position from directly overhead. The shot parameters raced through Victoria's mind with mathematical precision. Range, 287 yards by her estimation. Angle, approximately 35 degrees downward, which would affect bullet trajectory in ways that standard police snipers never train for. Wind, minimal in the enclosed mall environment, but HVAC systems could create unpredictable air currents. Target movement, Kozlov was shifting position every few seconds, never presenting a stable target for more than brief intervals. Most critically, the terrorist's explosive vest meant that a poorly placed shot could detonate the device and kill everyone in the food court. Victoria needed a shot that would cause instantaneous death, preventing any reflexive action that might trigger the explosives. That meant a headshot, specifically targeting the brainstem to ensure complete neural shutdown. At 287 yards, with a downward angle, through steel grating that could deflect the bullet by millimeters, with an unfamiliar rifle that she'd never fired before, targeting a moving enemy wearing a suicide vest surrounded by innocent hostages. In Afghanistan, Victoria's spotters had called her shots like this probability zero engagements, tactically necessary, but statistically impossible. 30 seconds, Kozlov announced. Victoria's breathing settled into the rhythm she'd learned at Quantico. Slow inhale, partial exhale, natural respiratory pause. Her heart rate dropped as her nervous system shifted into the state of hyper-awareness that military psychologists called flow state, the zone where conscious thought gave way to trained instinct and everything except the target faded into irrelevance. Through the crosshairs, she could see Kozlov's face clearly. He was younger than she'd initially estimated, probably mid-20s, with the kind of fervent certainty in his eyes that she'd learned to recognize in true believers. This wasn't someone acting from desperation or mental illness. This was someone who genuinely believed that murdering innocent people would serve a greater cause. The crosshairs settled on a point just above Kozlov's left ear, the optimal impact zone for immediate neural disruption. Victoria began her trigger squeeze, applying pressure with the smooth consistency that separated trained marksmen from amateur shooters. The trigger on the Remington had a clean break at approximately 4 pounds, heavier than she preferred but manageable. 15 seconds! The boy in Kozlov's grip was crying now, his small body shaking with terror. Through her peripheral vision, she could see her own children huddled with Officer Martinez, their faces turned upward towards sounds they couldn't identify, but somehow understood were connected to her mother's promise to come back to them. 10 seconds!
Victoria's finger reached the trigger's break point, that moment of perfect balance between intention and action. In her mind, she could see the bullet's path, 168 grains of copper-jacketed lead leaving the muzzle at 2,650 feet per second, following a ballistic arc that would drop it exactly 14.7 inches over the 287-yard distance, accounting for the downward angle and the slight deviation caused by the steel grating. 5 seconds. Kozlov raised his pistol toward the child's head. Victoria's trigger finger completed its rearward pressure with the smooth inevitability of a machine built for a single purpose. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with familiar authority. The .308 round punched through the steel grating with a sharp metallic ring, crossed the 300 yards of open space in less than half a second, and struck Alexei Kozlov precisely where Victoria had aimed it. The terrorists had snapped backward with the sudden violence of hydraulic shock. His body dropped like a puppet with severed strings, the pistol falling harmlessly from nerveless fingers as his nervous system simply ceased to function. The young boy he'd been threatening stumbled away, alive and unharmed. The explosive vest never detonated. Kozlov had died too quickly to trigger it. In the sudden silence that followed, Victoria remained motionless behind the rifle scope, her training demanding that she confirm the target was neutralized before declaring the engagement complete. Through the crosshairs, she could see the terrorist's body lying still. No movement, no breathing, no threat. "Target down," she whispered, using the radio brevity code that had once been as familiar as her own name. Below, in the food court, pandemonium erupted as hostages realized they were free. SWAT teams rushed forward to secure the area, and paramedics began treating people for shock and minor injuries. But Victoria barely registered the chaos. She was thinking about her children, about the promise she'd made, about the woman she'd been, and the woman she'd tried to become, and the warrior she'd apparently never stopped being. Staff Sergeant Thompson had fired her final shot. Now Victoria needed to find her way back to being someone's mother.
The silence in the food court lasted exactly 4 seconds, long enough for 300 people to process that the terrorist who had been threatening to murder a child was suddenly lying motionless on the floor, but not long enough for their minds to understand how it had happened. Then the screaming started. Not the screams of terror that had filled the space during Kozlov's threats, but the raw emotional release of people who'd been holding their breath for 47 minutes and suddenly found themselves able to breathe again. Parents rushed toward children they'd been separated from, teenagers collapsed in relief, elderly shoppers sat down heavily on whatever surfaces they could find as the adrenaline that had been keeping them upright finally drained away. Commander Hayes was the first law enforcement officer to reach Kozlov's body, her weapon drawn and her training demanding that she clear the immediate threat area before attending to anything else. She approached in a tactical crouch, using hand signals to coordinate her team's movements. But even from 20 feet away, she could see that there would be no resuscitation attempts. The terrorist's head had been destroyed with surgical precision, the kind of catastrophic wound that could only come from a high-velocity rifle round delivered with extraordinary accuracy. But Hayes's tactical mind was already wrestling with impossible questions. Where had the shot come from? None of her snipers had reported engaging the target. The angle of impact suggested a shooting position that didn't correspond to any of their established Overwatch locations. "Commander, this is Team Leader." Hayes spoke into her radio, her voice steady despite the confusion racing through her mind. "Target is down. Repeat, target is down. Cause of death appears to be single gunshot wound to the head. All units sound off. Who took the shot?" The responses crackled back through her earpiece in rapid succession. Sniper 1, negative on engagement. Sniper 2, no shot fired. Sniper 3, we had no clear firing solution. Hayes stared at Kozlov's body, then looked upward, following the apparent trajectory of the bullet that had ended the standoff. Somewhere above them,
Someone had taken an impossible shot through the mall's complex architecture and saved dozens of lives. Someone who wasn't part of her tactical team. Dr. Angela Foster, the crisis negotiator, was moving through the crowd of freed hostages, her training focused on immediate psychological triage for people who had just survived a trauma that would affect them for years. But she kept glancing toward the maintenance areas above the food court, trying to understand how the situation had resolved so suddenly and completely. "The angle doesn't make sense," she said to Hayes, during a brief moment when their paths crossed. "I've been through hundreds of tactical scenarios, and I've never seen a shooting position that could deliver that kind of precision from above. Who has access to the maintenance levels?" Hayes was wondering the same thing. Mall security had provided building schematics showing service corridors and maintenance areas, but those spaces weren't supposed to be accessible to civilians during an emergency lockdown. Yet somehow, someone had not only accessed those areas, but had used them to execute a shot that her trained snipers couldn't have made with ideal positioning and unlimited time. Officer Martinez was dealing with his own confusion as he tried to comfort Victoria's children, who had been asking increasingly frantic questions about where their mother had gone and when she would return. The coded message they had delivered, "Ghost needs to fly," meant nothing to him at the time, but now he was beginning to suspect it had been more significant than he had realized. "Your mom is helping the other police officers," he told Jake and Lily, the standard reassurance that usually worked with frightened children. But these kids were different. They weren't crying or clinging the way traumatized children typically did. Instead, they were watching the maintenance areas above with a kind of patient expectation that suggested they understood more about their mother's capabilities than Martinez had ever suspected. The crowd's initial chaos was beginning to organize itself as paramedics moved through the space, treating people for shock and minor injuries sustained during the initial panic. Local news crews were setting up outside the mall's perimeter, their satellite trucks creating a small city of journalists eager to report on what was already being called the Northgate Mall miracle. A terrorist attack stopped without a single civilian casualty. But the reporters didn't have the information that was circulating quietly among the tactical units. They didn't know about the impossible shot, the mysterious sniper, the fact that a situation which should have ended in massacre had instead been resolved with surgical precision by someone who wasn't supposed to exist. Detective Sullivan emerged from the maintenance corridors alone, his expression carefully neutral as he rejoined the response teams coordinating in the food court. Several officers approached him immediately, recognizing that as head of mall security, he would have access to information they needed. "Frank, we need to know who else had access to the upper levels during lockdown," Hayes said urgently. "Someone took a shot from above, and we need to identify and debrief them immediately."
Sullivan's response was measured and professional. "I'll need to review the security logs and access records. It's possible someone was in the maintenance areas when the lockdown began and got trapped there during the incident." "Trapped with a rifle?" Dr. Foster asked skeptically. "Or trapped and found one of our emergency weapons caches," Sullivan replied smoothly. "We keep backup equipment staged throughout the facility for exactly these kinds of situations." It was a plausible explanation that would satisfy immediate questions while buying time for more complicated truths to be processed privately. But Hayes wasn't entirely convinced. Her technical instincts were telling her that something much more significant had just happened. Something that would require careful investigation and possibly complete operational secrecy. 20 minutes after Kozlov's death, as paramedics were loading the last of the traumatized hostages into ambulances and bomb disposal units were carefully removing the terrorist's explosive vest, Victoria Thompson walked quietly out of a service corridor and back into the food court. She moved like any other civilian who had been hiding during the crisis. Slightly disoriented, obviously shaken, grateful to see that the danger had passed. Her hands were steady, her breathing was normal, and there was nothing in her appearance to suggest she had just executed one of the most technically demanding shots in the history of tactical operations. "Mommy!" Jake and Riley broke away from Officer Martinez and ran toward her with the desperate enthusiasm of children who had been separated from their primary source of security during a terrifying experience. Victoria dropped to her knees and gathered both children into her arms, holding them with an intensity that made nearby officers look away to give the family privacy during what was obviously an emotional reunion.
What they couldn't see, what Victoria hoped no one would ever see, was that her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from the physiological after effects of combat stress. "I told you I would come back," she whispered into her children's hair, breathing in their familiar scent and using it to anchor herself back in the identity of mother, protector, civilian. Commander Hayes approached the small family group, her expression respectful but professionally curious. "Ma'am, I'm Commander Hayes, Tampa Police SWAT. I know this has been traumatic, but we'll need to interview all witnesses as part of our investigation. Would you be available later today for a brief statement?" Victoria looked up at the commander with eyes that appeared appropriately grateful and slightly overwhelmed. "Of course, whatever you need. I'm just thankful everyone is safe." But as Hayes walked away to coordinate with other response units, Victoria caught Detective Sullivan's eye across the food court. He gave her the slightest nod, acknowledgement, respect, and a promise that some stories would remain untold. The official investigation would conclude that an unknown individual, probably with military training, had accessed the mall's maintenance areas during the crisis and used a police sniper rifle to neutralize the threat. The shot would be classified as tactically exceptional and studied in law enforcement training programs for years to come. But the identity of the shooter would remain officially unknown, lost in the chaos and confusion of a crisis that ended too quickly and too perfectly for anyone to ask too many questions. Victoria Thompson would go home that evening, help her children process their trauma, and return to the life she had built as a suburban mother. But she would never again be able to pretend that Staff Sergeant Thompson didn't exist, waiting patiently beneath the surface for the next time her particular skills might be needed.
The first news reports began broadcasting within an hour of Kozlov's death, but they told only fragments of a story that was far more complex than anyone realized. Channel 9 News led with "Terrorist Neutralized at Northgate Mall," featuring dramatic footage of SWAT teams and ambulances, interviews with traumatized hostages, and speculation about the unknown hero who had somehow ended the standoff with a single, impossible shot. What the reporters didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that the hero they were trying to identify was already at home in Clearwater Heights, making peanut butter sandwiches for two exhausted children who had spent the afternoon trying to process experiences that would reshape their understanding of their mother forever. Jake sat at the kitchen table, methodically coloring in a superhero coloring book while stealing glances at Victoria as she moved through their normal dinner routine. "Mom?" he said finally, his 7-year-old voice carrying a weight it had never held before. "When you went away at the mall, were you helping catch the bad man?" Victoria paused in her sandwich making, her hands still steady despite the complexity of the question. "I went to talk to the police officer, sweetheart, to make sure they knew where you were and that you were safe." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth was that their mother had spent 43 minutes calculating ballistic trajectories and breathing patterns before putting a .308 round through a terrorist's brainstem from 300 yards away. Some truths were too large for children to carry. Lily, who had been unusually quiet since they'd returned home, looked up from her stuffed rabbit and asked the question that would haunt Victoria for months. "Mommy, why weren't you scared like everyone else?" "Because I've been scared in worse places," Victoria thought. "Because I spent 2 years in Afghanistan learning that real fear doesn't show on your face when other people's lives depend on your actions. Because Staff Sergeant Thompson trained herself to function when scared civilians would freeze." But what she said was, "I was scared, baby. I was very scared. But sometimes when you're scared, you have to do what needs to be done anyway." The psychological impact of the day's events would ripple outward from Northgate Mall in ways that none of the participants could fully anticipate. For the hostages who had survived, the experience would become a defining moment that divided their lives into before and after. Many would require months of therapy to process the trauma. Some would develop PTSD. Others would find themselves changed in more positive ways, grateful for every ordinary moment they had previously taken for granted. For the law enforcement officers who had responded to the crisis, the mysterious shot would become a legend that would be discussed in training academies and tactical schools for decades. The official after-action report would classify the incident as resolved by unknown marksmen with apparent military training. But the technical details of the shot would be studied obsessively by sniper instructors trying to understand how someone had achieved what their computers said was ballistically impossible. Commander Hayes would spend weeks reviewing mall security footage trying to identify the shooter who had saved so many lives. She would interview every person with access to the maintenance areas, cross-reference military personnel databases, and analyze the ballistic evidence with forensic precision. But Victoria Thompson would never appear on her radar as anything more than another traumatized civilian who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Dr. Angela Foster would incorporate the Northgate Mall incident into her research on crisis psychology, particularly fascinated by witness reports that described seeing unusually calm individuals during the height of the terror. She would interview dozens of hostages, looking for patterns in how different people responded to extreme stress. One name that would appear in multiple witness statements was Victoria Thompson, described consistently as the mom who kept everyone calm and the woman who seemed to know what to do. But when Foster attempted to schedule a follow-up interview with Victoria, she would find a polite but firm declination. "I'm trying to help my children process this experience. I think it's best if we focus on moving forward rather than reliving the trauma." Detective Sullivan would become the unofficial guardian of Victoria's secret, carefully managing any investigation that came too close to identifying the actual shooter. His position as head of mall security gave him access to surveillance systems, witness statements, and physical evidence that could potentially expose her. But Sullivan understood the warrior code that transcended individual branches of service. Those who had served in combat looked out for each other, especially when civilian life failed to provide appropriate recognition for necessary actions. 3 weeks after the shooting, Sullivan would quietly transfer the maintenance area security footage to a personal hard drive, then report a technical malfunction that had corrupted the digital files from the third-floor service corridors. The backup systems would show similar malfunctions, and the IT contractors would conclude that the stress of the emergency lockdown had caused multiple simultaneous equipment failures.
The Remington 700 rifle that Victoria had used would be returned to the SWAT equipment inventory with a notation that it had been fired once during crisis operations, but no record of who had fired it. The ballistic evidence would be preserved in case of future legal proceedings, but without a suspect or weapon to match it against, the bullet fragments would eventually be filed away in evidence storage. The most profound changes would occur within Victoria's own family, though they would manifest in subtle ways that might take years to fully understand. David Thompson, her husband, would notice that his wife seemed somehow different when she returned from work that evening. Not traumatized or shaken the way he'd expected, but more present, more aware, more herself than she'd been in months. "You seem remarkably calm for someone who went through something like that," he would observe as they got ready for bed that night. "I think I remembered some things about myself that I'd forgotten," Victoria would reply, and David would sense that there were depths to that statement he wasn't meant to explore. Jake and Lily would begin to see their mother differently, not consciously, but in the way children intuitively understand when adults possess capabilities they hadn't previously recognized. They would feel safer around her, more secure, though they wouldn't be able to articulate why. In future playground conflicts or neighborhood emergencies, they would display an unusual confidence, a sense that whatever problems arose, their mom could handle them.
The broader Tampa community would process the Northgate Mall incident as a victory for law enforcement and emergency response coordination, unaware that their safety had actually been secured by a suburban mother with a secret past that she preferred to keep buried. The official narrative would credit exceptional tactical coordination and superior SWAT training for the resolution of the crisis. But in quiet corners of the veteran community, among retired Marines who gathered at VFW halls and American Legion posts, a different story would begin to circulate. A story about perfect shots taken under impossible conditions, about warriors who never truly retired, about the thin line between civilian and soldier that could disappear when innocent lives were at stake. Victoria Thompson's name would never be connected to those stories, but the legend of Ghost 6 would live on in the whispered conversations of people who understood that some skills were too important to lose and some protectors were too valuable to identify. She had fired one shot to save 300 lives, and the ripples from that single moment would continue spreading through countless other lives in ways she would never fully know.
2 weeks after the Northgate Mall incident, Victoria Thompson was back to her regular routine of school pickup, grocery shopping, and the 1,000 small tasks that filled the days of suburban mothers everywhere. On the surface, everything appeared exactly as it had been before. The same Honda Pilot with soccer ball stickers, the same worn jeans and practical ponytail, the same patient voice reminding Jake to finish his homework and Lily to brush her teeth. But those who looked closely might have noticed subtle changes in the way Victoria moved through the world. Her posture was straighter, more alert. Her eyes tracked movement with an awareness that hadn't been there before. And when she walked through crowded spaces like the grocery store or Jake's soccer practice, she unconsciously positioned herself with clear sight lines to exits and potential cover positions. The PTSD counseling session that the Tampa Police Department had recommended for all Northgate Mall survivors was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at a community center in downtown Tampa. Victoria sat in a circle with 14 other people who had been in the food court that day, listening to Dr. Sarah Mitchell, no relation, guide them through exercises designed to help process traumatic memories. It's important to remember that surviving a life-threatening situation often leaves us with complicated feelings, Dr. Mitchell explained to the group. Guilt about surviving when others might not have, anger at the situation, sometimes even a sense of unreality, like it happened to someone else. Victoria nodded at appropriate moments and participated in the discussion when asked direct questions, but internally, she was processing the experience from a completely different perspective than her fellow survivors. Where they described feeling helpless and terrified, she remembered the familiar calm of tactical assessment. Where they talked about the randomness and chaos of violence, she recalled the methodical execution of a plan that had saved their lives. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Mitchell said during one session, "you've been relatively quiet about your own experience. Would you like to share how that day affected you?" Victoria looked around the circle at faces she recognized from the mall. The elderly man who had been having lunch with his wife, the teenage girl who had been shopping with friends, the young mother whose toddler had been crying during the hostage situation. All of them looking at her with the expectation that she would describe the same kind of helpless terror they had experienced. "I think," Victoria said carefully, "that day reminded me that we're all capable of more than we realize when the people we care about are in danger. Sometimes ordinary people find extraordinary strength when they need it most." It was a generic response that satisfied the group's need for her participation without revealing anything meaningful about her actual experience. After the session, several people approached her to exchange phone numbers and discuss forming a survivor support network. Victoria politely provided her contact information, knowing she would never use theirs. The most challenging aspect of returning to normal life wasn't managing her own psychological adjustment. Staff Sergeant Thompson had been trained to compartmentalize traumatic experiences and continue functioning. The real challenge was watching her children process their memories of that day and try to understand how their mother fit into the official story they heard on television. Jake had started drawing pictures that worried his second-grade teacher. Not disturbing images of violence or trauma, but detailed diagrams of the mall's layout with careful notations about where people had been positioned and arrows indicating movement patterns. When Mrs. Peterson called in Victoria for a parent conference, she expressed concern about Jake's unusual focus on tactical details that seem beyond his age level. "I think he's trying to make sense of what happened by organizing the information," Victoria explained, studying her son's remarkably accurate architectural drawings. "Some children process trauma by trying to understand and control the narrative." What she didn't say was that Jake's drawings demonstrated an intuitive grasp of tactical thinking that suggested he had inherited more than just her eyes and her stubbornness. The arrows he had drawn showing how people moved to stay safe corresponded almost exactly to the optimal civilian evacuation patterns that Victoria had been calculating during the actual crisis. Lily's response to the trauma had been different, but equally revealing. She had started asking detailed questions about her mother's work schedule, wanting to know exactly where Victoria would be at different times of the day. Not from separation anxiety, but from what appeared to be a growing awareness that her mother possessed capabilities that weren't immediately visible. "Mommy," Lily asked one evening as Victoria tucked her into bed, "if bad people came to our house, would you be able to stop them? Daddy and I would both protect you," which was true, but didn't directly answer the question. "But you would know what to do, right? Like you did at the mall?" Victoria felt her breath catch. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "When you went to talk to the police officers, you knew exactly what to do, and then the bad man stopped being scary. You made it safe."
Children, Victoria realized, saw things that adults trained themselves to ignore. Lily had somehow understood that her mother's absence from the family group had coincided with the resolution of the crisis, even though she had no way of knowing the specific connection. "I love you and your brother more than anything in the world," Victoria said, smoothing Lily's hair back from her forehead. "And yes, I will always know what to do to keep you safe." It was perhaps the most honest statement she had made about the mall incident to anyone. David had also noticed changes in his wife, though he attributed them to post-traumatic growth rather than the reawakening of dormant military identity. Victoria seemed more confident, more present in family conversations, more engaged with community activities. She had started volunteering at the children's school and had joined the neighborhood watch program, roles that allowed her to exercise protective instincts in socially acceptable ways. "You seem happier lately," David observed one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. "I know that sounds strange given what you went through, but you seem more yourself." Victoria paused in loading the dishwasher, considering how to respond. "I think that experience reminded me of some things about myself that I'd forgotten. Capabilities I had that I wasn't using." "Like what?" "Like the ability to stay calm when other people are panicking. Like knowing how to assess situations and make good decisions under pressure. I spent so many years trying to be just a regular suburban mom that I forgot I could be other things too." David nodded, though Victoria could see he didn't fully understand the deeper implications of what she was saying. How could he? He had never been trained to kill other human beings with surgical precision, never experienced the strange combination of horror and satisfaction that came with being exceptionally good at something so terrible and necessary. But Victoria was beginning to understand that she didn't have to choose between being Staff Sergeant Thompson and being Victoria Thompson. The mall incident had proven that both identities could coexist, that the skills she learned in the Marines could serve her civilian life in ways she'd never anticipated. She was still the same mother who packed lunchboxes and attended parent-teacher conferences, but she was also someone who could put a bullet through a terrorist's brainstem at 300 yards to protect innocent lives. Both versions of herself were real, both were necessary, and both would always be part of who she was. The secret she carried wasn't a burden, it was a responsibility. And Victoria Thompson was finally at peace with both aspects of her identity.
6 months after the Northgate Mall incident, Victoria Thompson received an unexpected phone call that would crystallize everything she had learned about herself and her place in the world. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Colonel Patricia Harrison with the Marine Corps Reserve." The voice on the phone was crisp and professional. "I'm calling because your name has come up in connection with some specialized training programs we're developing. Would you be available to meet for a coffee sometime this week?" Victoria felt her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with a familiar sense of purpose she had been missing without realizing it. "I'm not sure what you mean, Colonel. I've been out of the service for 8 years. "Yes, ma'am, I'm aware of your service record. What I'm more interested in discussing is your current skill set and whether you might be interested in contributing to some training initiatives that could benefit both active duty personnel and civilian law enforcement." The meeting took place 3 days later at a small cafe in downtown Tampa, the same kind of anonymous public space where intelligence officers had briefed her on missions in Afghanistan. Colonel Harrison was younger than Victoria had expected, probably early 40s, with the kind of controlled intensity that came from years of operational responsibility. "I'm going to be direct with you, Mrs. Thompson," Harrison said after they'd exchanged pleasantries and ordered coffee. "We know what you did at Northgate Mall. Not officially, and not for any kind of public recognition, but we know." Victoria kept her expression neutral, though her mind immediately began calculating exit routes and potential threats. "I'm not sure what you mean, Colonel." "A 300-yard shot, through mall infrastructure, severe downward angle, unfamiliar weapon system, single round, zero collateral damage, perfect target neutralization." Harrison leaned forward slightly. "The ballistic analysis has been classified, but certain people in the military training community have seen the data. That shot is being studied at Quantico right now as an example of tactical excellence under impossible conditions." Victoria remained silent, neither confirming nor denying, but Harrison continued. "What interests us isn't the shot itself, impressive as it was, but the decision-making process that led to it. A civilian, a mother, who recognized that conventional law enforcement tactics were inadequate for the situation and took personal responsibility for resolving a crisis that could have killed hundreds of people. That kind of tactical thinking, that willingness to accept responsibility when others can't or won't act, is exactly what we need to teach the next generation of warriors." "I'm just a suburban mom, Colonel. I think you have me confused with someone else." Harrison smiled slightly. "Mrs. Thompson, Ghost 6 was a legend in my unit before I ever deployed. Your spotters used to tell stories about shots that defied physics. Your reputation for tactical innovation under extreme stress was used as a case study in advanced sniper training. You don't just disappear from being that person because you put on civilian clothes." The conversation continued for another hour, with Harrison outlining a consulting program that would allow Victoria to contribute to military and law enforcement training without compromising her civilian life or identity. The work would involve developing tactical scenarios, consulting on sniper training programs, and helping to design responses to domestic terrorism threats. "We're not asking you to become Staff Sergeant Thompson again. We're asking Victoria Thompson to share what she's learned about being both, about maintaining warrior capabilities while living as a protector of family and community, about making impossible decisions under pressure when civilian lives depend on military skills." Victoria drove home from that meeting with her mind churning through implications and possibilities. For the first time since her discharge, someone was offering her a way to use her specialized training in service of something larger than herself, but without requiring her to abandon the life she had built. That evening, she sat down with David and for the first time in their marriage told him the complete truth about what had happened at Northgate Mall and what it meant about who she really was. "I always knew there were parts of your military service you hadn't told me about. I just didn't realize how significant they were. Are you angry that I never told you?" "I'm proud of you," David replied without hesitation. "I'm proud that when innocent people were in danger, my wife was the person who saved them. And I'm proud that you trusted me enough to finally tell me the truth." The consulting work with the Marines began 2 months later, conducted mostly through secure communications and periodic trips to Quantico for specialized training development. Victoria found herself designing scenarios that combined her combat experience with her understanding of civilian psychology, creating training programs that prepared military personnel for the complex realities of domestic operations. More importantly, she began working with female Marines who were struggling with the transition from military to civilian identity, helping them understand that warrior skills could be channeled into protective roles without losing their essential nature.
Jake and Lily, now 9 and 7, had gradually learned more about their mother's background through age-appropriate conversations about service, sacrifice, and the different ways people contribute to their communities. They understood that their mom had been a soldier before she was their mother, and that some of the things she had learned as a soldier made her a better protector of their family. "Are you going to teach me how to shoot when I'm older?" Jake asked one evening as Victoria helped him with a school project about family history. "I'm going to teach you how to make good decisions when other people are counting on you," Victoria replied. "Whether that involves shooting or something completely different depends on what kind of person you choose to become." The neighborhood where the Thompson family lived had gradually become one of the safest in Tampa, not through any dramatic interventions, but because Victoria's presence had created a subtle network of awareness and preparedness among the residents. She had organized emergency response training, coordinated with local law enforcement on community safety initiatives, and somehow managed to make everyone feel more secure without ever mentioning her military background. Detective Sullivan, now retired from mall security and working as a private consultant, would occasionally text Victoria about situations where her expertise might be valuable. Not active operations, she had made it clear that her shooting days were behind her, but training opportunities, consultation requests, chances to pass on knowledge that could save lives. The official investigation into the Northgate Mall shooting had been quietly closed with a notation that the incident was resolved through exceptional tactical coordination between multiple agencies. The unknown sniper had become part of law enforcement legend, studied in training programs, but never publicly identified. But in the quiet moments of her daily life, when Victoria was making breakfast for her children, or attending their school events, or simply sitting in her backyard watching them play, she carried the knowledge that she had found a way to be completely herself: mother, protector, warrior, civilian, all integrated into one identity that served her family and her community. She had learned that some skills never fade, that some responsibilities never end, and that true strength comes not from choosing between different aspects of yourself, but from finding ways to honor all of them. Victoria Thompson had discovered that the most powerful thing a warrior can do is learn when not to fight, and the most important thing a protector can do is create a world where their children feel safe enough to dream about becoming anything they choose. Some heroes wear uniforms. Others wear yoga pants and drive Honda Pilots and pack lunchboxes with notes that say, "I love you," in handwriting that once calculated bullet trajectories across impossible distances. The difference isn't in the uniform. It's in the willingness to act when action is necessary, and the wisdom to know when that moment has arrived.